I must thank you, Ruben, for setting up the stage for me for my presentation. Because I think what people see with the biodiversity economy notes is that this is actually where the tacky hits the tar in terms of issues like dealing with natural capital. But you will see that some of the issues that Ruben raised, issues of leadership, I think, again, in this presentation, it's a whole different approach to what we've been doing up to now. And hopefully we will demonstrate that there are some places in South Africa where we actually are busy with some innovative and new approaches to dealing with conservation. So this is what most of you that come from a conservation background are familiar with, the typical view of biodiversity and the intrinsic values of biodiversity. So this is nothing new for any of you. This thing is not working very well. That's fine. I'll do it like this. But when we have to look at funding for conservation, we are challenged with things like these, socio-economic challenges, specifically in developing countries like South Africa. That's a map of looking at the areas. I'm afraid I'm going to fall off this thing. The poverty areas in South Africa. So if you talk to a politician about conservation, this is what's in his mind, is how do I address poverty? So if you look at KwaZulu-Natal in particular, where we are at the moment, it's the second largest population. It's the lowest employment rate in the country. 23% of households are living in poverty, but you want money for conservation. This is the areas in the country where households are still very much dependent on the natural resource base for survival. So again, what's the government's priority? It's not necessarily money for conservation, it's addressing these socio-economic challenges. So what we're sitting with is a situation like that. You have areas that have a high critical biodiversity area, but it's also the area that is critical for mining, or that might be the freshwater ecosystem priority areas. And what the politicians see is this is hampering development. So there's something wrong in the way that we actually communicate the message of conservation and its contribution to the challenges of developing countries. Now, if you look at this graph, you will see that this is how the wildlife sector has grown in the last couple of years. And what is particularly important here is to look at the wildlife sector's contribution to GDP and how that has grown. That is 9.3%, while the average contribution and growth of the economy is 1.52%. So if you tell a politician this, they might look different at conservation and the wildlife economy. So, you know, this might actually be a vehicle to start delivering on some of those socio-economic challenges, because this sector is outcompeting the general economy. So maybe it's time to start listening to these conservationists and what they are saying. So if we get back to what is happening in the mind of a politician, if we start telling them that the wildlife economy is growing at that rate, at a 3% contribution to GDP, but also in terms of jobs, it's outcompeting many of the other sectors like agriculture. Again, I think we might actually get them to listen, and we've seen that. We've given this presentation to a couple of ministers and people in the politics, and the moment that you start showing them how conservation and wildlife areas can start addressing their challenges, they look at us very different from what they did before. So maybe what we should do is have a different form of language, and this is where the whole issue of natural capital comes from. So instead of just talking about hunting, maybe we should look at the role that that plays in food security, and we know that in the hunting season, the red meat purchase in South Africa is decreasing with 20% because people are actually sourcing their protein themselves. So that starts playing a role in food security. So all of these areas and the whole wildlife economy is based on or dependent on extensive wildlife systems. And we've heard that that contributes to the wildlife economy, it contributes to conservation targets, and it contributes to ecosystem services. But maybe it's also contributing to socio-economic development. And what are the three main areas that contributes? It's protected areas, community areas, and then private sector land. But if you look at protected areas, the currency is often primarily a conservation currency that we talk about. It's seen as this is hampering development. It stands in the way of development. It's not pro-development. If you look at communal areas, there's huge potential there, but in terms of capacity and in terms of resources to unlock that, it's a huge requirement. And then if you look at private sector, their currency is primarily a financial currency. And there's some concerns about the latest development in the private sector and the impact that that might actually have on the resource base and on conservation, where previously it's been seen as complementary. So just look at some of the reasons why I say so. This is some of the data that shows that intensive and selective breeding in a study area in Limpopo, how that has increased over three periods from 2006 to 2015. And you'll see there that 45% of game ranches is involved in intensive and selective breeding. About 25% generate most of the income from that. The issue or the concern is the fragmentation of the landscape and that impact on ecosystem services and on functioning, well-functioning ecosystems. So we see that there was about a 64% increase in the length of fences in those areas. Now, that should raise concern for us. So these areas that is supposed to contribute to the wildlife economy, whether it's protected areas, community areas, or private sector land, there's some serious challenges with all of them in terms of their contribution. In this specific case, you'll see those areas, the study area here, that area and that area here where we've seen that intensification is also the areas where our wild dogs and cheetahs roam freely in the country. So what is the implication of this on threatened species conservation? But we want to grow the economy, and currently the private sector is seen as one of those drivers of this wildlife economy. So the concern is all of these areas that we depend on for the wildlife economy are being fragmented. There's climate change issues, and then this major threat of land use change. So what is it that we need? We need to convert the value of wildlife resources into positive land use outcomes contributing to both conservation and the economy. Because if we're only focusing on conservation, like we do in some of the protected areas, we've seen that we don't have money to do what we're supposed to do. If we only focus on the financial side, we see that we might have an impact on the long-term sustainability and environmental issues. So we need to find that balance. So then if you look at the various production systems currently, often when we look at production systems, the focus is on intensive, semi-intensive, and extensive and return on investment. And there you can see intensive is outcompeting the extensive areas. However, if you start adding the value of ecosystems, you will see that extensive systems are doing much better. If you then start looking at the jobs that are being created in the various systems, you'll see here on extensive systems that there's much more depth and variety in the jobs created there. And then if you look at agreements, again, these areas contribute much more to a lot of other conservation objectives than some of the other areas. And lastly, the risks here is much lower than it is in the other areas. So you might ask, but why am I focusing on all of these things? And I think it's important that we understand the challenges that we are facing. If we want to go forward in terms of conserving our wildlife resources, we have to do things differently. There's major threats that we are facing, whether you're a protected area, whether you're private sector, or whether you're a community. And if we don't start looking in a different way at these challenges, we might end up in a few years from now and saying, how did we end up in this cul-de-sac? There's no way out. And especially if you look at the challenges that we've seen yesterday in terms of climate change. So what is it that we need? We need integrated land use strategies. We need rural socio-economic growth. We need synergy, and we need to focus that in specific areas. We need to leverage the role of protected areas in rural areas from a socio-economic perspective, not just from a conservation perspective. We have to look at establishing economies of scale, the value chain of the wildlife, because there's huge opportunities within that. We have to look at partnerships between various role players, and the solution for that is biodiversity economy nodes. Now, what a biodiversity economy node is, it's essentially a vehicle that assists in addressing all of these challenges. It's an integrated land use strategy where we have collaboration between communities, private sector, protected areas, creating economies of scale. Because the moment that we have economies of scale, we can start competing as a land use against things like mining. But where do we establish these biodiversity economy nodes? Some work has been done in KwaZulu-Natal, looking at where conservation as a land use can compete with things like agriculture, mining, and this is the results of the work that was done. Those two areas there were identified as areas with huge potential where the wildlife can actually, as a land use, outcompete other economic activities. In this study case, the Umfolozi Biodiversity Economy Node, that's the first economy node that's being established in South Africa. It also played a major role in water resources conservation. So, to get back to that slide, so if you look at protected areas, we know that we're not performing very well on our MET assessments. We know that the funding for protected areas is being reduced. This is the picture in Africa, where a lot of the protected areas mining activities taking place, and then we've got Shishlubi and Mfolozi where there's also a threat of mining. But how do you compete as one reserve against a mine? But if you compete as a biodiversity economy node with all of the economic benefits of that node, you might actually be able to compete in terms of your contributions to the economy. Don't get concerned about all of the details. This is some work that has been done in Kruger National Park, but what is important that you must look at here is that this is a study that has been done where we started looking at how protected areas can contribute outside of the reserve itself in terms of socio-economic inputs. So employment and business opportunities, infrastructure support, managing a relationship restoration, capacity building, ecosystem services. So now, if you look at the budget and you go and ask the politician for money, he will say, you know, your budget you don't generate a lot of income on Shishlubi and Mfolozi, but if this is your contribution to the economy, let's talk. Maybe you can actually start functioning as an accelerator of socio-economic growth. And now I don't have my glasses on, but later on, the details of this economic impact, the number of SMMEs that have been created, throughout the value chain, the opportunities is immense. But it's not necessarily in Kruger Park or in Shishlubi and Mfolozi. So only in terms of purchasing power, if Shishlubi and Mfolozi purchases all their products and their services from local SMMEs and entrepreneurs, it's 41 million into the local economy. Have you quantified that yet? No. But you look at the budget and say, we're not making enough money, we must put up more lodges. We don't look at this impact that reserves are having in the economy. So then we look at communities, and there's huge areas that are available on communal land. But the social investment required to unlock those areas is huge. And who's going to do it? Government. We've seen that in the last how many years since democracy, how many of these community areas have really been pulled into the wildlife economy and are really productive? Very few of them, because there's major challenges. This is an area around that specific biodiversity economy node where the communities have partnered with private sector, and they've got various business models from sugarcane, forestry, game farming, avos, all of those. And these sugarcane are looking much better than communities that have not partnered with private sector. But that same community must make a decision on whether they're going to have more sugarcane and more forestry and disregard the wildlife areas. So we have to assist in creating financial mechanisms that show that they can actually be financially viable in the wildlife areas. So this is the area, private sector partnered with communities. This is the various models that they have, various formal agreements, and every year they are generating R1 million in income. And they reinvest that money into their financial models. So my question to you is, shouldn't there be partnership with private sector, with protected areas as well? Because dropping fences here with Upati Nature Reserve expands the opportunities and create opportunities for collaboration between private sector, the communities, and the protected area. And maybe private sector is much better in terms of their purchasing than government is. So maybe they can assist in increasing the economic viability and feasibility of those protected areas. But we have to look at these things different. These are some of the community areas that are now fenced into protected areas and where economic activities can take place. From an investor perspective, this means investor confidence. They now get access by partnering with communities that are partnering with a protected area. They get access to strategic locations, reduce development costs as we drop fences, and investor confidence, because it's now not just a community, it's now a community in partnership with a protected area and private sector. So, my time is running out a bit, so I just put in this slide. Again, don't get too concerned about the dates and so on. This is throughout the value chain, the opportunities in the wildlife sector that you can look at. So there's huge opportunities for us to unlock the economy. This is just in terms of hunting. You can see all of the areas in the value chain where economic activities can take place. But we disregard these when we look at the role that the wildlife are playing in the economy. So in this Umfolozi Biodiversity Economy Initiative, it's an initiative between SA Hunters and KwaZulu-Natal is located in wildlife. And this is some of the key projects in the node. And we've done some assessments, and you can see here each one of the areas, the profit without debt servicing per 1,000 hectare, ecosystem services value, combined value, and then the investments that are being secured, and the types of jobs that will be created over that period. Now, this is much different from what we do in our current protected area management plans. We don't report on these things. So now, again, you can see this is leveraged private sector investment into the wildlife areas. This is the number of jobs that are being created. So, in conclusion, in this specific project, unfortunately I can't give you the statistics because this is now one of the presidential priorities, and there might be a release on the details at a later stage, but there's huge areas of restituted community areas that are now pulled into the vibrant wildlife economy. The critical biodiversity areas that are being expanded through partnerships between private sector and government is immense. The saving to government by using these private sector partnerships and community partnerships and creating these economies of scale is in this specific area over 200 million rand, because now they achieve transformation objectives, economic objectives, and conservation objectives through partnerships without purchasing the land. And Andy will in his presentation talk about that a bit more. The value of community land is increasing about 3 times in these areas. So we're expanding protected areas while creating economic activities at the same time. So in conclusion, biodiversity economy nodes, we believe, is really a vehicle to deliver on both conservation objectives and socio-economic objectives. But this is one of our key challenges, is paradigm paralysis, because to get people to think differently about how we do things, the type of partnerships, the leadership that we need for this, is something that is really a big challenge that we have to face. Thank you.